Alberta's plan targets the 28% of Alberta's greenhouse gases that come from coal-fired electricity and transportation, and will let the 46%, well, I'll show you here. So what the Alberta plan does, this is transportation. It targets this with taxes, and it targets the coal-fired electricity. This is the elephant in the room. This is from the production of oil and gas in Alberta, including the sands, and they are letting the biggest one here grow by almost 50%. So these two sectors, the transportation and electricity, are being sacrificed so that the sands can grow and take up all the room in their reduction. So the sands emissions cap is a misnomer. It's really a license to raise carbon pollution. Phase out by 2040. Most of the world's carbon fuels must stay in the ground to avoid catastrophic warming, cautions a 2015 study in the scientific journal Nature. There is no point, and I quote, "No point in continuing to explore for new deposits of oil and gas anywhere in the world, since we cannot afford to extract what has already been discovered," wrote University of London economists Christopher McGlade and Paul Ekins. The authors specify the fossil fuels that must remain unused to limit the world to below 2 degrees Celsius rise. So, for example, 88% of coal reserves must remain in the soil. Well, what about oil? Over 430 billion barrels of global oil must remain unburned. What about Canada's reserves? Well, this is what they say. For the world to have a reasonable prospect of meeting the 2-degree target, they write that no more than 7.5 billion barrels of oil from the Alberta oil sands can be produced. We produce that in about 7.5 years. So that is, you would have to, if we actually met that, we'd have to if we started next year, by 2025, we'd have to cease all sands production. My proposal is not as extreme as that. I'm saying 2040. In 2011, Clive Mather, the former CEO of Shell Canada, warned that by 2041, and I quote, "We won't be burning hydrocarbons the way we do today. Our enemies are not at the door yet, but they are beginning to circle around Alberta." Well, last week, Shell divested most of its stake in the sands. The council that Ed Stelmach appointed in 2011 warned that, and I quote, "The creation of an affordable, environmentally friendly alternative to oil would be a great thing for the world. It could be economically devastating for Alberta if, when it happens, we are still heavily dependent on oil exports." End of quote. So if steps are not taken, the risk, the council argued, is that by 2040, and they use that date 2040, quote, "Albertans will find ourselves watching the global economic game from the sidelines because our resource wealth made us too comfortable. We may have heavy oil to sell, but few or no profitable markets wishing to buy." So this is, I just did this quote here, and these are the people who were on the Alberta Council, Ed Stelmach's council. Their sage advice, unfortunately, fell on deaf ears. Alberta's current government promotes expanding the sands, not phasing them out. Will the market phase out the sands? Perhaps, but not necessarily. The sands are pricey and marginal. Their future success depends on 1, flat or falling world supply of conventional oil, 2, growing oil demand globally, 3, little serious climate action, 4, a high world oil price. Well, the oil price rose a bit since the December cut supply in December, but in the last week, as that rise has totally disappeared. And the level is less than half of what it was 2.5 years ago. As a result, 17 major sands projects were postponed or canceled. And that was almost half the shelved oil projects in the world were shelved in Alberta sands. Jeff Rubin, the former chief economist of the CIBC Bank, wrote that, and I quote, "Hanging over the oil sands industry like the sword of Damocles is the fact that they are hemorrhaging red ink. Oil imports into the US have fallen in half in the last 5 years. The world is awash in oil, especially US shale oil. Expansion of the sands," and this is a quote from him, "have no economic context and could not be funded by any financial institution in Canada." So, former chief economist of CIBC Bank. Peak demand for oil. Are we into peak demand for oil? It's difficult to predict future oil prices. So many factors are in play, but peak world oil demand is likely, in my opinion. There's a lot of controversy about this. Why? Rising fuel efficiency standards, growing gasoline carbon taxes, and cheaper batteries that helps the shift to electric vehicles. And there are other factors as well. The International Energy Agency and OPEC disagree. They predict slower but growing oil demand to 2040. But they're both known to be overly optimistic. Royal Dutch Shell, on the other hand, predicts peak oil demand coming in 5 to 15 years. Alistair Syme, a Citigroup oil analyst, states that for the first time, drillers realize they can afford to bring on only the most competitive assets. Only low-cost oil has a future. Some existing sands projects are expanding, but no new major sands projects have been announced in the last 2.5 years. Several major oil companies have pulled back or fully out. Total, France's largest oil corporation, Statoil, and Shell. Divestment. The sands face headwinds from the divestment movement that promotes ditching stocks and ethically dodgy activities. Started on US campuses in 2011 as a moral campaign, the divestment movement has spread to 688 institutions in 76 countries and moved to faith-based organizations, large insurers, pension funds, and banks. Divestment movement certainly targets the sands as one of their primary targets. Stranded assets. How many have heard that term, stranded assets? More serious for new sands projects is a growing recognition that carbon fuel investments, especially high cost and high carbon polluting ones, are becoming stranded assets. Those are obsolete investments that must be written off as a loss. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada, warns that the shift to a lower carbon economy poses risks to the values of many assets. He says that companies need to disclose the carbon intensity of different assets and how they plan to transition to the net zero future, he contends. Government action. If the market is turning negative about the sands, can we rely on it to phase them out? No. Only governments can do it to ensure a soft landing, provide retraining and a plan for alternative jobs for workers in the sands. Increased extraction leads directly to higher emissions. Only governments can enforce the needed hard limits to how much carbon fuel can be extracted. Instead of helping, Ottawa is making things worse by approving major expansions of 2 bitumen exporting pipelines, Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Line and Enbridge's Line 3. If built, they will encourage the growth of sands output, and so will President Trump's approval of TransCanada Keystone XL line to the US Gulf Coast. If, despite opposition, all 3 lines are built, they will drive a stake through Canada's climate promises. So if you're going to build a pipeline, you're going to start it in a few years, it's going to take until 2050. You're going to have to keep it full to pay off the capital costs of building those pipelines. And you're going to have put it mainly sands oil through those pipelines. So how can we be getting off oil and sands oil by 2050 if we are building infrastructure to increase them and keep them going full bore? Lessons from other energy phase-outs. Well, phasing out polluting sunset industries is difficult and wrenching for workers and communities involved. But with climate change disasters looming, it can and must be done. The Green Paper looks at lessons from the phase-outs of phasing out the coal-generated power in Ontario and Alberta's plans to do the same. Ontario closed them by 2014, and Alberta plans to do the same by 2030. Closing coal-fired power in Ontario met a lot of opposition, but it succeeded and caused the single biggest drop in Canada's greenhouse gases. Going off coal in Alberta will be a major step as well. But the way that the phasing out of coal was sold to Albertans was done, in fact, in a way to allow the sands to increase. So it was presented as the only credible way to let the sands growth and emissions. So overall, that's not good. I haven't got time to discuss the coal phase-out in Ontario and Alberta. I invite you to read the Green Paper. There may be some copies here, certainly online. You can look at it on how environmental groups in both provinces made alliances with doctors to warn about the health dangers from coal power plants. The public got convinced first, and then governments followed. A similar scenario can happen with phasing out the sands. Well, praying for another oil boom is an Alberta mantra, but in 2017 is now folly. This is the ideal point to start the transitioning off the sands. It's much more difficult for governments to stop a booming industry than it is to help already displaced workers and communities get off a sunset industry. And that's what the province and federal government should do, and I'd like to see them do it in combination. As Jeff Rubin argues, investment cutbacks today spare potentially massive write-downs tomorrow. Can the rising frequency and intensity of natural disasters in Alberta become the wedge issues that health was in gaining support for phasing out coal? Southern Alberta saw horrendous floods in 2013. 100,000 residents were driven from their homes. 4 people died. Until the Fort McMurray wildfire last May, those floods were Canada's costliest natural disaster ever. And it was billed as a 1-in-100-year event. With climate change, devastating floods are predicted to happen more often. No single fire, like the one that devastated Fort McMurray, can be attributed to global warming, but it greatly raises the likelihood. The Prairie Climate Change Center projects that by 2050, Fort McMurray is going to get 20 days of above 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. Today, there's only 3 days on average of above 30, but we're going to be, so the chances of forest fires like that are increasing. And it's imperative to inform Albertans of these dangers and their links to carbon pollution. Steps to phase out the sands. The first step is to follow the 2006 calls for a moratorium on new sands projects. Make it a permanent moratorium. The second step is to give a closing time for sands projects that long ago paid off their capital costs, starting with the initial Suncor and Syncrude units, the ones that started over 50 years ago. And that's what happened with coal. You know, if coal was 50 years old, it would be phased out. The third step is to annually lower the greenhouse gas ceiling on all remaining sands projects until they collectively reach zero by 2040. Principles for a just transition. It's vital that phasing out the sands be accompanied by a well-thought-out plan to provide workers and communities with alternative work and retraining. Canada's oil and gas sector is a poor job creator. If you look at 107 industry categories in Alberta, oil and gas extraction is tied for last place in jobs per unit of GDP. The building stage of sands projects generates many jobs, but the operating those projects employs many fewer. So a plan for deep conservation and renewable energy can generate more jobs in Canada than Canada's current failed focus on carbon fuel exports. More jobs are created by saving a unit of carbon energy than in digging up, burning, and emitting one. Manufacturing creates many more jobs per $1 million invested than the petroleum industry, and so does construction. New construction jobs should be green ones, retrofitting all buildings in Canada, building LRT and subways, high-speed intercity trains, district heating, wind, tidal, deep geothermal, and solar power. Long before the sands became commercially feasible, the federal and Alberta governments put a great deal of research money over several decades into how to unlock the sands. Government scientists, including the legendary Dr. Carl Clark, solved the riddle of tar sands. Without their work, the sands would not have been developed. Giant oil corporations reaped and are still reaping enormous dividends from the publicly paid for research. What we need now is for the federal and provincial governments to devote as much research money in today's dollars to plan a useful employment for sands workers in the shift to a low-carbon future. I also talk about an alternative energy strategy for Canada in my book, After the Sands. Okay, my conclusion. The Alberta and Canadian governments could ignore the sands' long-term prospects and allow the market to determine the speed and ways the sands are shut down. It could let sands workers and communities dependent on them fend for themselves, be acted upon. A better alternative is for Alberta and Ottawa to manage the transition off the sands so that it phases in how workers are retrained to help build a thriving renewable energy and conservation future. Act so our children and grandchildren have a better future.
All right, thank you very much. And that was, you're right, a little controversial, and it was really insightful. Got somewhat of a social science question for you, and that is, how do we address the very real perception that exists out there that the claimed urgency to curtail carbon emissions is just another in a continuous series of activists' demand to basically control the agenda on the advancement of humankind? So the science is kind of aside. This is about the perception of people. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think we have to show people that governments elsewhere are taking action. People blame China. What should we do here? China's building all these coal plants, and that certainly was true until 2013. But China is coal consumption is actually going down. It's dropped in the last 3 years, and they're closing 1,000 coal mines. So it's important to realize it isn't just activists. 195 governments got together in Paris, and they made a deal, and a lot of them are acting on it. So I think that story has to get out there.
So I know carbon capture and storage pretty well. I know it's completely uneconomic from a coal perspective, but I've always wondered if there was a role for doing such a high-cost technology for a higher-cost product such as oil. I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, I'm not the technical expert, but from what I understand, the sources of greenhouse gases are so dispersed in the sands that it is not economic to try and store them. It's probably actually easier with coal, because if you have this big chimney and you can, it's all concentrated in a plant, you can actually do carbon capture there. But there are problems with that, as you and other doctors have pointed out, that there are other emissions that are very harmful. But in the sands, the sources are incredibly dispersed. It doesn't look like there's going to be, on a large scale, a commercially viable way to do that.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Dr. Laxer.